Good afternoon. My name is Michael Otten, and I represent an ongoing association of business and law school alumni calling themselves Reform Election Now. Our group was originally inspired by a 2017 report where business executive Catherine Gale and Harvard professor Michael Porter hypothesized that election process is a major cause of much of the current polarization and governmental paralysis, identifying the election process as a major detriment to U.S. competitiveness worldwide. Our small group is not made up of political scientists, but merely concerned citizens. Having said that, we are aware that our nation's basic principles and constitution were built on a foundation of political philosophy from the 18th century. So why not look to the 21st century political scientists and legal scholars to propose solutions to some of today's governance issues? Happily, the requisite intellectuals to engage in this enterprise exist today. Our panelists this afternoon will share with us the ambitious goals that are being set by a 21st century academic task force, which will bring scientific rigor to study potential political innovations available for our era. We are honored to be the platform for the launch of this effort. First, NYU Professor Richard Pildes is the co-chair of the Election Reform Task Force being announced today. He's a constitutional law scholar who was recently named to the Presidential Commission to review arguments for and against various reforms of the U.S. Supreme Court. He's one of the country's leading experts on legal issues concerning American democracy and the structure of American government, including voting rights, elections and campaigns, as well as separation of powers, administrative law, and constitutional law. Senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, Professor Larry Diamond is one of the principal forces on the task force steering committee, establishing a timeline and ensuring that the disciplines of social and political science are respected while moving the initiative forward to actionable recommendations. His experience analyzing worldwide trends in democracy will provide context for the task force's work and has been instrumental in designing a group that can bring together the diverse views of our times. Professor Didi is Associate Director and Senior Research Scholar at Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. She brings to the task force extensive knowledge from her studies of comparative politics with a focus on democratization, corruption and clientelism, political parties and institutions, and political reform. We are fortunate that constitutional law professor Edward Foley, director of the election law at Ohio State, and author of Ballot Battles, The History of Disputed Elections in the United States, is also able to join us on the panel, although not on the original meeting announcement. Finally, a President Emerita of the Women's National Republican Club, Robin Weaver, will be our moderator, bringing to the table a special skill of being able to catalyze civil discussion of controversial issues. There are potentially others from the task force on the call who panelists might introduce as the discussion evolves. We hope that all the attendees on the call will be willing to ask tough questions and provide their thoughts as to how best this task force can achieve its objectives. Please use the raise hand function in the reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen if and when you would like to pose a question or make a comment. And we would appreciate your limiting any particular input to no more than 1 minute. You can also comment in the Zoom chat window with no restrictions on time. One of us will call on you probably in the order of raised hands, upon which we would ask you to unmute your microphone and state your question. Otherwise, please keep your microphone muted to avoid background noise. In fact, I hear some background noise right now, so we will try to mute everybody before I turn it over to Robin Weaver to start the ball rolling. Let's see. Okay. Robin, please unmute yourself. And
I will do that. Okay. Thank you, Mike. I'm truly honored to be moderating a panel of such distinguished scholars who are sincerely engaged in reforming our election process in a way that reduces polarization. Just to give you a quick overview of this evening's format, Rick Pildes will give us a summary of the problem, the concept of the task force, and provide the intended goals of the group. Didi will explain the evolving role that businesses and other stakeholders have come to play in the election process. Larry Diamond will explain how the task force will operate and give us a granular view of the task force and a timeline for some of its goals. Ned will also weigh in, as Mike has mentioned, he's joining the panel. We're very pleased about that. After the panelists have given their presentations, we're going to have about 20 minutes for questions. That will be followed by a poll in which all of you can participate. And then following the poll, we'll have questions and answers from all of you. Before I turn over the program to Rick, I thought it was worth mentioning an editorial that was in this Sunday's Charleston Gazette by Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia. In the editorial, Senator Manchin explained why he is voting against the For the People Act, also known as H.R. 1. In his editorial, Senator Manchin stated, "I believe that partisan voting legislation will destroy the already weakening binds of our democracy. American democracy is something special. It is bigger than one party or the tweet-filled attack politics of the moment. It is my sincere hope that all of us, especially those who are privileged to serve, remember our responsibility to do more to unite this country before it is too late." So that's a very sobering thought. And with that thought, I want to ask the first question of Rick. Can we have effective governance in a world in which the political parties are so fragmented and there are so many independent entrepreneurs in politics? And as an aside, I would note that most people view the Republican Party as becoming more and more far right, and the Democrat Party is becoming more and more far left. So with that, Rick, I open it up to you.
Well, thanks very much, Robin, and thanks to Michael. And it's incredibly inspiring to be able to talk to a group of people like you all who have been committed to these issues through your organization, but are also, willing to take the time at the end of the day in the summer already to talk about these incredibly serious issues that are of great concern to so many of us who care about American democracy. The purpose of the task force that we have stood up, and in fact, this is the first time we are talking about the task force in public, is to focus with sort of laser-like intensity on political reforms that can help mitigate extremism or the hyperpolarization of our political culture. There are lots of groups working on voting reforms, and there are lots of issues in that space to worry about. And in fact, a number of us on the task force are working on other issues in other forums. But those of us who have come together for this task force are extremely concerned. Indeed, we think this is probably the most urgent issue facing American democracy. Can we do things through political reform to try to minimize or mitigate some of the extremist forces that are both very threatening to our politics, but also make it very hard to govern the country? And as Robin said, the concern about effective governance is front and center in our work, because unless democratic governments can deliver on the issues that many people care about, the dangers for democracy, withdrawal, alienation, and even worse, become all the greater. So we've brought together about 35 to 40 people with expertise on these issues. Some of the expertise comes from people who've been working on these issues in the trenches for many years. One of our members is Ben Ginsberg, who some of you may know from CNN, who was the top Republican lawyer for about 35 years on many of these issues. Others are academic experts who have devoted their careers to working on these issues. We are interdisciplinary, we are politically broad, we have people from across the spectrum in the group. And the idea is to focus on particular areas where we think certain kinds of political reforms are likely to make a difference in the struggle against extremism and polarization. And a major part of our emphasis is bringing to bear the best data, the best state of knowledge about these reforms, including knowledge and evidence about reforms that are proposed for these issues that we think are not actually likely to be effective. And so we want to bring together a reform sensibility focused on these issues, but deeply committed to understanding what we know, what we don't know, what we need to know more about to actually advance reform along this general front. We've identified 4 particular areas that we think are the most promising for these kinds of reforms. Some will be familiar to you, maybe some less so. The first area is the general kind of domain of the primary elections, which are, of course, a major problem in the drive towards extremism today, the fear of being primaried. What are the most effective ways of thinking about restructuring the primary process or even minimizing the role of primaries altogether? So structure of primaries then combined with various ideas about different forms of voting, different modes of voting, not just ranked choice voting, which I assume many of you have read about or know about or have had talks about, although that's very important. But there are other forms of voting that we may talk about in more detail later that also are likely to help ensure candidates who have the broadest appeal in the electorate actually getting through to the general election and being able to prevail in the general election. So how can we structure or restructure voting systems in the primary process so that those candidates with the broadest appeal are encouraged to run and are more likely to be successful? The second area that we're going to focus on is the presidential nominations process. One of the things that's happened in the modern era with that process is that we now have, as you know, these fields of 20 people running in the primaries. It makes it much easier for factional candidates to actually be successful, since you only need 35% of the vote to win a primary in a very crowded field. What can we do with the presidential nominations process to encourage, again, the selection of candidates who appeal more broadly within the parties rather than to narrow factional interest? And there are some ideas there we can talk about in more detail on that front. The third area we've identified is redistricting, but with a different focus than a lot of the discussion about redistricting. So, of course, there's been talk for many years now about the desirability, at least many people think, of getting districting out of the hands of politicians, giving it to commissions of one sort or another. There's been talk about developing plans that are more fair in terms of their partisan outcomes and developing measures for that. But we think one of the major things redistricting needs to focus much more on is the creation of competitive election districts, because competitive districts force candidates to appeal more towards the center of the electorate, where the tipping point voters are. It keeps politicians much more accountable than when they're in safe seats. When they're in safe seats, all they worry about is not being primaried from the extremes of their party. They know they're going to win the general election, so there's no pressure to come back towards the center, or not as much as there needs to be. So redistricting that creates maybe twice as many competitive seats as currently exist in Congress, we think could have a significant effect on the dynamics within Congress. And then the fourth area we're going to focus on is campaign finance, but again, with a slightly different perspective than a lot of the reform discussion. We do believe there are things that can be done in the name of reform that will actually make the problem of polarization and extremism worse. And we are very concerned that the current sort of focal point of political reform in this area, which is part of the bill that Robin talked about, the big bill the Democrats have put forward in Congress, involves what's called a small donor matching program, where candidates will get $6 in public funds for every dollar they raise from donors under $200. We think the candidates who will benefit the most from that system are the more extreme candidates from the wings of the parties. If you look at the data on which candidates benefit most from small dollars, it tends to be the candidates who create the most outrage, have the most visibility, are on cable television the most. And so we are very concerned that even though we understand the motivations in terms of political quality and participation and the like that motivate those proposals, they will actually make this problem worse. And so we want to look at the data that's out there on that. We want to then consider alternative ways of reforming the financing system that are not as likely to generate or further throw fuel on the fires of polarization in the way we think small donor matching programs are likely to do. So the goal is to, in each of these areas, bring the best state of the learning that's out there, the empirical knowledge that's out there to bear, to develop proposals for more research if more research is needed on certain questions, and then to take what we come up with and really push it out there as effectively as we can at the state level where we think reform is most likely to take place, not just with legislatures, but with voter initiatives in states that have direct democracy procedures, because that's been one of the more effective routes to political reform. And so we want to sort of work in this first vein of figuring out what is likely to be most effective, and then become very aggressive in pushing these ideas out and trying to actually get them adopted, primarily, I think, at the state level. So let me stop there. Don't want to talk at you too long. I never think that's too good on Zoom. And let me bring some of the other steering committee members who are on the call into the discussion. So I'll turn it back to Robin.
I think Didi is up next.
Oh, Didi. Okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. Thanks to Reform Elections Now for organizing this, and to the leaders of the task force, the chairs, for convening it. So now that Rick has introduced the 4 areas that the task force is going to focus on, I was going to situate our work in bigger debates about reform and democracy in the United States. After the 2020 election, which had record high turnout, the Democrats made H.R. 1, which includes many reforms in the areas that our task force will address, one of their foremost agenda items. And as Robin mentioned, H.R. 1 is sort of dead on arrival. It's passed the House 2 times, actually, but is definitely has no chance of passing the Senate. Its provisions were seen as partisan, even though H.R. 1's components are very popular with the public. So it's a right moment in our society to consider institutional and structural reforms, because we know the public is aware that our electoral system has problems, and that they seem to sense that something about our representative institutions isn't working. There are many stakeholders who are interested in reform and have been for years, including elected officials, different advocacy groups, and increasingly actors who don't typically get involved in talking about reform, like members of the business community. Many organizations that have propped up that combine sort of civic actors and business actors to try to leverage their voice and resources to talk about how to improve our democratic outcomes. And this is because polarization and extremism pose a threat, perhaps even an existential threat, to democracy as we've known it. We know that democracy can't function when we can't agree on the basic rules and procedures that govern free and fair elections. It creates uncertainty, it erodes trust in institutions, which is already at record lows, and at worst, it can drive civil unrest or even political violence, which we have unfortunately seen erupt this past year. But the concerns that we see cropping up are very diffuse. Americans have a general sense that things are not working. There's not a consensus about the precise problems that reforms should solve or how they should solve them. So this task force, by taking on the issue of extremism and polarization, is a narrow enough focus that we think we can mobilize many different actors around it. We hope to find solutions that can moderate our politics, which is a very clear goal, by changing the incentives and procedures around which types of candidates are selected or how preferences are sort of aggregated and counted into representative outcomes. In these 4 areas of voting and electoral systems, presidential nominations, campaign finance, and redistricting, we know that there are certain things in the status quo that are contributing to polarization. And our task is to figure out exactly what those pathways are and what kinds of reforms would be able to create something different, to be able to moderate our politics. And while, I guess, a promising trend is that while majorities of Americans are not politically extreme, we know that there are sort of institutional and structural factors that are creating either minority rule or facilitating extremism, which means that solutions are possible. You know, if you just had a really divided electorate, it would be more difficult to talk about institutional solutions. So we think that reducing polarization will accomplish other democratic goals, like creating a more representative democracy and better sort of bipartisan and coalitional agreement about these rules of fair play after the 2020 election. Further, by assembling a nonpartisan task force of academics, we hope that we can avoid accusations of partisanship. Our work is different from that of advocacy groups or politicians, since we have no partisan agenda to speak of. We are singularly focused on specific goals that were outlined at the front. And finally, we think it's important for scholars to use this moment to leverage their expertise and make concrete recommendations, which is something that academics can be very reluctant to do. They really want to understand things deeply, but they don't necessarily want to talk about what should happen next. But we know from reforms in other countries that academic expertise can play a crucial role. So New Zealand, for example, reformed its entire electoral system in 1993 after a royal commission composed of academics and lawyers released a report recommending what's called a mixed member proportional system. Britain commissioned a similar group of experts on a referendum on the alternative vote in 2011, which failed when it was put to the public. But nonetheless, these kinds of recommendations we think can be very impactful. And I'll leave it there. Rick already started to talk about our audience and dissemination, but I think that's what Larry is going to go into more detail about now. Larry. Oh, he's muted.
I'll just take off from there. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be with you again. I've had the privilege of visiting with you on a different recent occasion. Let me speak first about the distinctiveness of this effort, and then our theory of change and how I think we can have an impact. I should begin by saying, because it may be on the minds of some of you, that, you know, we've made a conscious decision not to deal with certain issues, not because they're not important, not because they aren't even more urgently important than what we're doing now, but because other people are dealing with them. And so since I anticipate it could be a question that would be asked, I will preempt the question by saying, I think there is nothing more urgent in the defense of democracy in the United States, which I think is gravely at risk now, than mobilizing to fight voter suppression and the new efforts in state legislatures at voter subversion, actually changing the rules of election administration and certification and authority in ways that might enable some partisan officials to reverse the results of a legitimate electoral outcome in the United States. But that's a short-term urgent challenge, and there are people working on that. And frankly, we're not going to permanently turn the corner on those threats to subvert American democracy if we don't deal with the threats that we have identified that are deeper and longer term, and that, you know, I think we are really the only going outfit that's going to bring academic knowledge to bear upon, and that is the intertwined challenge of how to combat, limit, disincentivize structurally extremism and polarization, as Rick and Didi have eloquently articulated. And I think we're different, fresh and innovative, if not almost unique in a few other ways. Most importantly, we're self-constituted. It's a daring and audacious effort on the part of academics, first of all, to try and constitute a diverse group of themselves, scholars and some kind of analytically oriented professionals who are diverse as to party ideology, starting reform preferences, we don't all agree on those, geography, discipline, gender, race, etc. And to do so in a way where You know, nobody owns us, nobody's sponsoring us. And we just kind of go out and look for the funding, which we're in the process of doing now, to enable us to do our work. The only real institutional grounding we have is in our respective universities, and particularly where we're administratively based, which is Ned Foley's center, election law at Ohio State. And I love the fact that we are administratively grounded in the center of the country, and at our Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University, where Didi and I are. Otherwise, you know, we have drawn together as a group of scholars and a few kind of scholarly oriented past practitioners who are trying to wrestle with these questions, intertwined, but a little bit distinct, subtly distinct questions of how to limit and turn back the incentives to extremism on the one hand and polarization on the other, and they interact. We want to have an impact on policy. This is not a purely academic exercise. And part of our deliberate purpose is to inform and advance political reform efforts, and to have an impact in, frankly, restoring American democracy to better health. But our lead purpose is not activism, it's to deepen the knowledge base of potential, of the way the system works now, and of the possible impact of different reforms, including reforms that are being implemented, such as ranked choice voting in the New York City mayoral election. And I think the historic, potentially game-changing reform, which is, of course, what Catherine Gell now favors and is a variation of what Porter and Gell have proposed, the top four system that Alaska has adopted by voter initiative in November 2020, that will be the system to elect state and federal officials from Alaska in 2022. So we're going to evaluate these reforms, although we're in a little bit of an interesting time dilemma, because we'd like to deliver a first tranche of analysis by the fall of 2022. But of course, Alaska won't happen in the general election until November 2022. And we will definitely need to evaluate the impact of that. And I think, you know, in some instances, we may get consensus among us on a particular reform in a particular area, whether it's campaign finance or presidential nominations or whatever, that we think is highly desirable. And in others, we may recommend a menu or a suite of some reform options that we would urge states or you know, national policy makers to kind of choose from among. And we could say more about that. That is done actually some very creative thinking and writing about that with respect to electoral reform. Let me say a word about a theory of change. I think this is speaking personally now, but I have a hunch that my colleagues may at least share my view partially. And I think I've said this to you all on a previous occasion. I believe we have entered a period in the United States of America that is in some ways the most dangerous period, at least since 1876, and maybe since the Civil War, but in some ways bears the promise and creativity of the progressive era in the early 20th century in the United States that gave us a number of game-changing reforms, including direct election of senators and the voter initiative and other things you're aware of, not least having half of the people on this call have the right to vote. But it isn't going to happen in one fell swoop. It isn't going to happen as a gift from above by enlightened elites. We're going to have to work for it, state by state, locality by locality, and through very hard advocacy as happened in the progressive era. And I think momentum for this is gathering in informal reform networks that many of us are members of, informal and semi-formal, that are bipartisan, I think like this one here. In philanthropic networks, a number of major philanthropic donors are getting more and more deeply involved in this cause. And through reform organizations that have become advocates for change and funders and organizers of change, particularly at the state level, such as Unite America, Represent Us, Leadership Now, Fair Vote. Maybe we could include the Election Reform Network, Protect Democracy, Common Cause, No Labels, and many others. We aren't owned, engineered, or sponsored by any one of these organizations. But once we have done our own independent analysis as scholars, we will be prepared to link up with organizations that may be prepared to take our knowledge base and run with it into advocacy campaigns. And there are going to be a number of networks that we can tap into. I think an important one will be the National Association of State Legislators, that we can be prepared to actually present our findings to, and on the basis of the knowledge and research we have mobilized, actually advocate for some specific reforms or menu of reforms. So I want to stop here. I could say much more about the possibilities here, but I think we are in a seminal moment in American political history that is very, very dark and dangerous in ways that I don't need to elaborate on, but is also full of potential, innovation, promise, and creativity in other respects. And I think we are unique in having the potential now, the will and the intellectual training and resources, all we need is the financial resources, to bring to bear a much stronger base of knowledge into this debate.
So this is Ned Foley at Ohio State, and I just want to say I'm honored to be part of the task force and part of the discussion tonight. And I just want to highlight one point that Didi made that I think is core to our mission and how the task force is looking at things. And Didi mentioned how there's a certain amount of polarization and extremism that, whether we like it or not, exists in our political culture. And so any electoral system, any system of election law that intends to fairly represent the preferences of the voters is going to have to deal with that and acknowledge the reality of those preferences. But as Rick also mentioned, in terms of reforms possibly making things worse, rules, whether they're the rules that we have now or the rules that we could have in the future, they have the capacity to magnify extremism and polarization, or to distort what are the actual authentic preferences that voters have, so that the outputs of elections do not accurately reflect the voter inputs. And so what our task force is trying to do in all four of these areas is look at the way in which rules and institutions exacerbate the problem, and either deviate or distort or magnify this danger of extremism that Larry mentioned, making it worse than it otherwise would be just because of existing cultural factors. So in that sense, we're focused on the way in which rules and institutions amplify the problem, and therefore reforms of rules and institutions could, as Rick said, ameliorate or redress the conditions. And just one final thought with respect to the issue of primary elections, which, as Rick said, was so important and is one of our focal points. As part of the way in which we're looking at the way in which primary elections have the capacity for that distorting effect by being primaried, that changes political behavior. It's the primaries themselves, but it's also the interrelationship between the primaries and the rules of the general election. and how primaries as an antecedent to the general election and the interaction between the two components of the overall system can have that kind of distorting effect. So I just would add that that's part of our focus. And with that, can I turn it back to you, Robin, for discussion?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for that wonderful summary. You know, in listening to all of you, a couple things jumped out at me. One, you're going to look at the empirical data to see which reforms make the most sense. So in terms of all the reforms you're proposing, maybe it's premature to start prioritizing which reforms are going to be the most important. And it also seems Rick made the point that any activity or any goal that's going to be met is likely to be done at the state level. So taking that into account, it seems like you're not going to have one size fits all. So what works in Arizona may not work in Georgia and so forth in terms of getting something done. I was especially intrigued, I guess, by the primary process, because what you're seeing in so many states is the extreme elements of the party sort of dominate, who gets the nomination from the primary standpoint. And for example, you have 5 Republican senators who have decided not to run for re-election, in large part because they're probably concerned about being primary and then having a tough general election. So just speak to, what you can see happening in a relatively short period of time that could help in those state situations. And I might add that I don't know if it's so true from the Democrat Party side, but certainly the Republican Party side. What you're seeing in the states is the state party is really dominating, not so much the national party. So how do you get all of that to work in a way that can achieve less polarization and more moderation? I know that's a long way of asking the question, but anyway, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll take a quick crack at that and then turn to my fellow, task force members, because, that's sort of where I started my entry point into this topic. Because based in Ohio, we were looking at whether or not there would be an appropriate reform in Ohio to deal with this primary problem, and the fact that our senator, quite popular Senator Rob Portman, was retiring, perhaps because of the kinds of things that we're talking about. And so we looked at the reform that Larry mentioned that Alaska's adopted, a top 4 system with ranked choice voting, to see whether or not through a ballot initiative that would be a suitable reform in a very short time frame for Ohio. And again, picking up the point that we've all made about the need for empirical research and good social science, it became apparent to us that what works in one state might not work in another state, that while the problems may be similar in different states, as you mentioned there, we've got 5 US senators who are all retiring, but the states are somewhat different. Pennsylvania is not Missouri, which is not Alabama, and North Carolina and Ohio, those are the 5. And in fact, another task force member, Charles Stewart, a political scientist at MIT, who may be in the audience today, and I are, in conjunction with the kind of work that we're doing, are going to try to do some empirical research to see whether different reforms interacting with different states mean that you can't have a one-size-fits-all, and that the different reforms have different effects depending on what state you're talking about. So that's an example of how the kind of research that I might do as a law professor on election rules can work with the kind of research that political scientists do to hopefully expand our knowledge so that we have knowledge-based analysis for the kinds of issues that you mentioned. Is that responsive?
It is. Anyone else want to comment on that question?
I just wanted to jump in quickly on the question of parties, which you mentioned. So Robin, you noted that state parties seem to be exerting a lot of sort of influence or have been very active about candidates. So I know Rick feels this way too. I think that sometimes people associate polarization with the parties being strong or think that they are sort of implicitly connected, when really we have seen a weakening of national parties for a variety of reasons. Part of it has to do with the diffusion of campaign finance that empowers non-party groups in the selection of candidates. And part of it has to do with the presidential nominations process, where the national party once exerted much more power. And now you've seen a rise in primary elections since the 1970s. So even though the task force does not take up a question of parties per se, We do think that strong parties are an antidote to well, I won't speak for everyone, but I don't think that anyone thinks that the task should be weakening parties further. And instead, I think that some of the reforms may have the effect of strengthening parties. There are different people on the task force, as Larry mentioned, who have different ideas coming into it about how you might strengthen parties, or whether some types of strengthening parties is good and some types is bad. But I think that overall, one of our goals is to think about why it is that you get sometimes incentives to have anti-party candidates or extremist candidates that the national party does not support, and how you can change incentives around that dynamic.
One thing that seems to be of concern is we've become very personality driven, more so than issue driven. So how do you see us being able to educate voters on the issues so that they're more focused on issues and not necessarily personalities? Because I think oftentimes if they actually knew what a candidate stood for, they may not want to vote for that particular candidate. But because it's become so personality driven, how do you try to prevent that? And how do you see your group educating the public on this whole topic of election reform?
That's a tricky question because, Robin, it interacts with the problem of polarization and potentially extremism in diverse and potentially non-obvious ways. So I'd say the majority of us on this task force, the vast majority, I'm sure, as political scientists and legal scholars, are institutionalists, and we believe in the importance of parties. At least one prominent member does, and he's a former prominent party figure and congressman. And you could argue there are some people who think that having more independents who are not members of a political party, but also are coming more from the center rather than the extremes, and provide a third way or a third alternative when there is a polarized option between the two political parties, that such a candidate, man or woman, running in a ranked choice race, which is probably the only way they could ever win, is usually the only way they could ever win, might be depolarizing. Now, would it also be destabilizing of the party system? I don't know. Or democracy by destabilizing the party system. I mean, that's part of what we need to address. But I think there's been, a lot of simplistic thinking about these issues and a lot of frozen thinking about these issues, including, I will say, if I can be self-critical, and here all three of my other colleagues may simply disagree with me, frozen thinking by scholars on this. And while I think that getting people to vote for programs rather than personalities, and issues rather than personalities, is generally a good idea, when the program becomes extreme and the personality becomes moderating, the logic may be flipped. So I am, my personal priority is on whatever will disincentivize, marginalize, or, to use Rick's favorite verb, rare verb, cabin, extremism, kind of, put it within boundaries that can't, reach an electoral victory. And I am more agnostic than my colleagues may be on how we achieve that, but I'll let them speak for themselves.
Yeah, Robin, if I could, I guess, respond to your question. So because we haven't, of course, sunk our teeth into all of these different areas very deeply yet, it's not, I don't want to pre-commit a particular answer, But I would say from where I sit right now, if I could identify one institutional structure that I think is the most damaging to our political process, it is the primary election and what those have become. And there are lots of studies now by political scientists who interview politicians and campaign people, and basically they tell you what you already know, which is the candidates are the office holders are the most worried about being punished by primary voters for compromise. They're more worried about those primary voters than donors. They're more worried about the primary voters than the general election voters. And it's the extremism of primary voters, and then the effort to preempt having a candidate challenging from the extremes that leads to taking extreme positions in office and also feeling like you're going to be punished for compromising. So, if I had to put my chips in right now on one reform, that would be the one I'd focus on. But what I want to say also is there is no silver bullet. And the way I think we all think about this is that, each bulwark you put in the system to mitigate extremism that enters in through this route or that route or that route, helps stem that flow or that tide. But it's a mistake to think there's some single solution that could get rid of this problem. You have to work on a lot of fronts. And I'll also say, and I think this was implicit in your question, I think there is more of an opening, including more of a bipartisan opening for some of these initiatives than people often tend to think. If you look, I've been talking for almost 30 years about the how much better it would be to have districting done by independent commissions. Not everybody necessarily agrees with that. But I think it's inherently pathological to have the people who are the most directly affected by districting to have the power to draw their own districts. And no other democracy is set up that way. But it was very hard to get interest in that issue among citizens for many, many years. And in the last decade, certainly I've seen that interest really grow dramatically and concretely in the number of states through voter initiatives that have actually had voters choose to create independent commissions to do their state's districting. And that includes red states and blue states. It's happened in places like Utah, Missouri. It's happened in Michigan, California. So that's one front. The other front is, both parties, I think if they think in a clear-headed way, should recognize that obviously they have big internal divisions. And those divisions can mean that in the voting system we have right now, good candidates from their parties are at risk of not being able to make it to the general election, even if they would be the most competitive candidate in the general election. And so I think there is a self-interest on the part of both parties in many states in reforms like ranked choice voting, which would allow, if you're a Republican and there's 2 or 3 strong Republicans, you can vote them 1, 2, 3. But it's not the case that if you vote for one and she's not able to make it through, that's kind of the end of things. So that's another area where we also have seen in recent years voters choosing to adopt ranked choice voting in states or cities that are ideologically diverse. So I'm not sure how much people are aware of this, but just in the last month or so, I think it's like 23 cities in Utah, including Salt Lake City, voters adopted ranked choice voting. As you know, we talked about it already, in Alaska, in the last election, voters on the ballot chose a top 4 primary structure with ranked choice voting in the general election. Voters in Maine a couple of years ago chose to adopt ranked choice voting for state and federal elections. New York City, where I am, is going to be using it in a couple of weeks for the first time. It's actually going to be the largest number of people who have ever voted in a ranked choice voting election. So I think that there are both self-interested reasons, if they can be brought clearly to the surface, that some people in both parties and some political party figures would recognize the desirability of some of these reforms. I'm not sure the parties benefit from having faction candidates win their presidential nominations process. Sometimes they might get lucky and the candidate gets elected, but other times, they're bypassing their most effective candidate. So I think that there's, more opening than some people think. I don't think it exists at the national level, as we've said, and I think that's a big mistake. I think given how polarized things are and the intensity of things at the national level, the culture is not nearly as pragmatic as it is at more local levels. But I think I think those are the areas that I see some promise in.
One thing I want to ask about, and Larry mentioned this, there's a growing number of registered independents in this country, and you have a situation where you have closed primaries. So if you're a registered independent, you're precluded from voting, in a particular party's primary. How do you see this playing into some of the reforms you're looking at, the open and closed primary system?
Well, so open primaries that was an idea reformers had a bit ago, 10, 15 years ago, as a way of, there are many motivations for it. One is, it's fair, people should be able to vote in the primary even if they're not affiliated, as long as you're not a member of the other party. But also people argue it would create more moderate candidates because the idea was these independents would be moderating forces. Now that turns out not to be true. Open primaries just have not made a difference in the kind of candidates who make it through the primaries. And one of the things to be careful of in this area, and I hope one of the things I think we can contribute is there tends to be in the reformist community, things start becoming a matter of kind of herding behavior. And, certain groups start really coalescing around one idea and it kind of just takes on a momentum of its own. And then it gets very hard to resist that train hurtling down the track. And, academics, social scientists, people who actually are willing to look at the data and tell us what we can expect and cannot expect from certain sorts of reforms need to be listened to more. And we're hoping to give them more voice. So I think, people are alienated from the political parties. They don't want to register more and more, and younger people don't want to register with one party or the other. Now, they do tend to vote pretty regularly for one party or the other, but it's a sign of alienation from the political process. It's a sign of disgust and disdain, and I don't really want to have that much to do with it. And I think part of it is, if democratic governments can't deliver effectively on the issues that people view as most central to their lives and their concerns, it inevitably produces withdrawal or distrust or disaffection or even worse. And so we've had a political process that, over, I don't know how you date it exactly, but let's say roughly 20 years, has just been paralyzed with respect to many of the big issues that people have been insisting government do something about, even though they may differ about what government should do. And it's particularly true in our system with separated powers and bicameralism, that it's all the more difficult to make that system work. And the system can't really work very well unless there's some amount of negotiation and compromising across party lines. It's still the case, there's one of our steering group members who's not here today, the leading political scientist who's pointed this out. It's still the case that overwhelmingly major legislation in the US gets enacted with some degree of bipartisan support. There are exceptions, obviously we've seen them in the last several years, but they're exceptions. And they're one-offs. You can use reconciliation, a couple of times. But you need bipartisan support to get major legislation in this bicameral separated power system. And so you've got to have a system that selects candidates who in office are going to be more likely to be the kinds of office holders who can make those compromises and negotiate those deals.
Robin, if I can just add
Sure, go ahead, Ned.
quick point. on the idea of open primaries versus closed primaries, I think it's really important to think about how that issue relates to other aspects of the system. And related to that point, Rick mentioned how both Maine and Alaska have adopted ranked choice voting, but they've done so, even though their ranked choice voting components of their new rules are similar, they're placed in the context of systems that otherwise are quite different. As Rick said, the Alaska system has this open primary that picks 4 candidates and then uses ranked choice voting. Maine has a closed primary system that's very different from Alaska. So one of the things that we want to look at is the interrelationship of these components, because they operate both mathematically and practically in different ways. And that's why we want to do social science research, because it's not just whether or not you have an open or closed primary, it's how that rule exists in connection with other rules too.
Before I get to one big question, that's the whole issue of campaign finance. There's a little bit of a tangential question I'd like to ask, because education is going to be such an important component of any kind of election reform. And that's the role the media plays, both social media, the mainstream media. And it's become very polarized, as all of you know. So if I'm a Democrat, I tend to watch CNN or MSNBC. If I'm a Republican, I watch Fox or Newsmax. How do you see this playing into the need to educate the voters on election reform? Because again, it's very polarized.
Well, I want others to add, but one of the things that we're thinking about is, again, ballot initiative campaigns and how reform can be made accessible to the public. I mean, one of the things about some of these reforms is if they're described in certain ways, they're very complicated. I mean, the mathematics of ranked choice voting, could be explained in a way that makes people's eyes glaze over, or it can be explained in ways that are much more accessible through data visualization and other techniques. And so as we think about reform possibilities, again, another aspect of this is to do empirical research on what works in terms of voter education. We're looking for ways to translate ideas into publicly accessible formats. Maybe later on I could describe that in more detail, but that's very top of mind in some of our work.
Let me mention something that I'm not even sure I've shared with my colleagues, but I'll just mention it. I think it's an example of how we can turn the corner here, Robin. Some of you know that in September of 2019, the Center for Deliberative Democracy at Stanford, which I'm kind of another thing I'm a little bit affiliated with, helped to organize a deliberative poll of 500 Americans to deliberate over a long weekend on a number of public policy issues confronting the United States on the economy, healthcare, immigration, and so on. And when we brought them together with balanced briefing papers under good conditions and a truly representative sample of, we had everybody there from solid Trumpers to, far left progressives and everybody in between. And they spent a weekend getting to know one another and having these balanced briefing papers and a chance to interview alternative experts and so on. Something interesting happened. They got a little bit detached from their preconceptions, if they had them, and their fixed positions. They changed their views on a number of issues. And in a context where the triggers that happen on Fox News and NBC, MSNBC, and Facebook and so on of Trump and AOC and this and that, the triggers were all removed. And we just talked about the issues and people's concerns and so on. They were able to find common ground. So we are planning to do this again. And political reform is one of the 6 issues we hope to address. And I'll just bet anybody here that if we can pull this off, and if we do it in the next 12 months, it would be like we're doing it here over online, and we've got an automated platform to do it. I think you will find that, even people on, the kind of the Trumpian right, the progressive left, there's a lot of core values they care about in terms of choice, accountability, fairness, being heard, that they actually kind of share with one another. And I think they can find some common ground. I think we may find that there are certain reform principles that they might agree on in the abstract when you take it out of partisan politics. And I think we may also discover what kinds of arguments resonate with different kinds of voters in terms of making the case for reform. And so I wouldn't presume anything. I think the challenge is that social media, and to some extent cable television, and all of the forms of dialogue and encapsulation and information bubbles that people are plunged into are propelling them down these silos that obstruct kind of reasoned deliberation and open-minded consideration. Somehow, I think they were able to partially transcend that in Alaska, which is how that package of reforms barely passed. And I think in combination with creative means of engaging segments of the American public and maybe diffusing what we learn, we might achieve some very surprising ways of addressing the problem you raised.
And Robin, oh, sorry. Oh, Robin, you're muted.
Okay, I was going to say on that optimistic note, we wanted to put up our poll so we have a chance to poll our audience in terms of what they think is the most important goal for electoral reform in the United States. We have 5 choices. I think Herb is going to put up the poll. Number 1 is reducing political polarization. Number 2 is making it more difficult for extremists to be elected. 3, making elections fairer. 4, enabling more parties to win representation in Congress. And 5, establishing campaign financing transparency and/or limits. Herb, are you able to put up the poll itself?
The poll is up right now. People are voting.
Are we supposed to vote? Your
Right now.
stickers?
On this question
probably not.
of, Robin, can I add something quickly on this?
Absolutely,
question?
Didi, yes.
So, on Newsmax viewers, I'm not sure we can convince them, but I will say that Jane Mayer reported in the New Yorker that when different Republican groups were polling on HR1, that every component of it was popular, that it was basically you had to attack the strategy had to be to attack the bill on the whole as a power grab. But I think that there is so much dissatisfaction with politics. You see, our previous president, Trump, was elected because he said that all of DC was corrupt. So it's not the case necessarily that all voters think the status quo is working well. And I think that if you can develop compelling, nonpartisan messages around making institutions fairer and functional, that you can at least convince people who feel some sense that they want something to change, whether that's individuals who might be swing voters or even be conservative. I think that they are changeable. And also large organizations, whether it's civic groups, business groups, a lot of the types of reform groups that Larry mentioned are really wanting to hang their hat on something that has solid evidence behind it. And that's something that I think the task force can achieve.
Can I just say that I'd like to jump in and say, I'll give you five more seconds or so for those 10 people or so who haven't voted, then we'll close the polls. If you want to vote, do it now.
One thing I'm hearing from all of you is it seems like there's a real impetus to promote ranked choice voting. Do you think that's a fair comment?
I think we're certainly curious about it. I mean, it's a reform that is already being implemented, so it gives us the opportunity to see what its effects are. It has some nice theoretical assumptions underlying it that seem to align it with moderation, less polarization. So it certainly seems like the kind of reform that, I won't speak for everyone, but that can't hurt. It hasn't really, in the places where it's in use, it hasn't been shown to polarize further. But that is something that the task force will also examine.
Yeah, I'll say two things about that real quickly. One is that the coverage in New York City, I don't know how many of you are in New York and read this coverage also, but in the Democratic primary going on right now, which is going to be a ranked choice primary, there are stories already that have been appearing about candidates going to areas of the city that are not their natural areas to campaign, not where their base is, that they would normally not campaign in, because they're looking to get listed as a second choice or a third choice from those voters who are not otherwise inclined to vote for them. So just on the ground right now, there is already, at least by news accounts, some very, very significant and positive effects. Now, I also want to say, without getting too much into technical detail, there are different ways of structuring ranked choice voting. And not every form is going to be as effective at what we're trying to accomplish as others. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we're going to be focusing on, that I think there is a little bit not enough appreciation of at the moment, that there are better and worse ways of structuring ranked choice voting to make it more likely that candidates with the broadest appeal are going to be successful. And so that's one of the things we hope to make some progress on, and to sort of educate people who are already supportive of ranked choice voting.
It's certainly going to be interesting in New York, that's for sure.
I'm really glad that Rick made that last point, because I was thinking about saying it, and he said it exactly right. Ranked choice voting is a family of reforms, not a single thing, and the different versions of it potentially can make big differences, again, varying state to state. So that's why we need the empirical research and the work of the task force. So thank you for that.
Let me just say, before can I just jump in and just, I guess everybody's seen the results of the poll, reducing political polarization and making it more difficult for extremists to be elected, account for about 2/3 of people's first choices. And so I'm going to stop the sharing, and we can continue.
Well, first of all, I'd like to have the panel just comment on that. There probably are no surprises that reducing political polarization garnered the largest percentage. Any observations you have there? And I'd also like to open it up for questions from our audience at this point too.
Well, it's gratifying, unless people are just trying to, make us feel good. It's gratifying to see
Right.
that such a high percentage of people listening agree that polarization and extremism are enormous challenges that need to be confronted. And let me just put that point another way too. There, a lot of reform groups are not focused on the systemic effects of reforms or policies. They tend to focus in sort of much more discrete or kind of narrow ways. They just don't think in terms of how are these reforms going to affect the overall nature of the political system, and will they, fuel or mitigate polarization. They're focused on access or integrity of the process, things like that. So that's something that I think doesn't get enough attention in a lot of the discussions about how, what kinds of changes are desirable. I see in the questions, of course, lots of people are raised questions about the effect of the media and social media on polarization, and there's no question that those are huge contributors. We're not focused on that issue. Other people have focused on that. It's hard to understand what one might actually do about that. I think the problem is very, very deep. I think social media plays a huge role in driving extremism and polarization. And I think it's a real challenge for democracy. But nonetheless, candidates still want to be elected. They respond to the incentives that the institutional structures and the rules for competition generate. If they are forced to appeal to a broader array of voters in order to get elected, even with the intense polarization of the activists in both parties, there's still lots and lots of Americans who are less ideological, more in the center, have different views on different issues that don't line up in some simple way with the way the parties get organized. And institutional design, election rules that give incentives to those kinds of candidates and reward those kinds of candidates are still important in a world in which the media is what it is. And, you know, as someone said, unless some tycoon comes in and buys up all the polarizing cable channels and produces more balanced commentary and finds that a good business model, that's not going to change. And social media is largely ungovernable, except at, you know, at the margins.
Oh, thank you, Rick. Mike, we have time for questions, I assume, from the audience, right?
Yeah, why don't we ask people if they want to raise a question to go
There's
to
quite a lot in the chat. If you want to go through those, Robin.
Yeah, there are quite a few. Let me just.
Can I jump in? I'd like to ask a question. It's Herb Kaplan. Independents were alluded to before, but independents account for about 40% of the voting public compared to the mid-20s for the Republicans or Democrats. And so independents are a huge factor. Will the task force be doing research to understand who these independents are? And could they be forming a third party in the future? Or at the end of the day, are they fundamentally philosophically aligned with one of the two parties?
The task force is not going to examine who are the voters. We're interested in institutions and processes. But also there's tons of political science evidence already on independents showing two things. First, that they still tend to vote with one party consistently, so they're leaners. And second of all, that they tend to be more cynical and distrusting than people who do identify with a political party. So that's a problem. And I think this gets back to Rick's point about responsiveness, that elected officials need to actually engage with what it is that voters are demanding in terms of the policies that they wish passed or the goals that they want to see, and show that they are able to do their job as legislators. So we're hoping that some of the reforms we're discussing create incentives for legislators to be elected and to want to work by compromising, negotiating about big issues, which is something that Congress has been less good at in an era of polarization.
This may be a little harsh sounding, but maybe it's helpful to sharpen things up a bit. So, and I'm thinking of some of the questions in the comments. So there are a lot of, I think, what I call romantic ideas about democracy that need to be put to the side. In the United States, in the system we have, it's a romantic idea, in my view, to think there's going to be serious third party or fourth party politics. It doesn't happen in systems with what are called first past the post elections like we have in the United States, for all sorts of reasons. That's why the Democratic and Republican parties have been the two dominant parties since the 1850s, or the two parties since the 1850s. So you have to think about how you make that system work. If you wanted to change to a completely different system, which isn't going to happen, a proportional representation system, then of course you'd have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 parties in the United States. There are all sorts of problems with PR systems. We can't talk about them here. You can look at what Israel's going through right now as one example. But that's a fantasy, I think, to think that we're going to get third party and that it would be a good thing in this system. The second thing is, and this goes to a question about the voucher program in Seattle, which someone had asked about. It's a consistent imagination of reformers that all voters just want to be as actively engaged in politics as the reformers are. And that's just simply not true. Most Americans are going to be much less engaged than the activists who participate most intensely in politics. And so you can't imagine that, oh, if we just give people vouchers, all of them are going to start contributing to campaigns and candidates because that's what they really want to do. You're going to have the same problem with vouchers that we have with other systems of financing, which is it may be a little bit more representative, but in Seattle, 3 to 4% of the people who get vouchers actually use them. You're not getting a representative electorate. So Personally, if we're going to have public financing, I prefer it to be in the form of not vouchers, not matching small donors, but traditional grants of funds to candidates based on various kind of formulas that come from general funds. Because you try to build it on the backs of voters, and you're going to get the same dynamics that we have in all these other areas. So you know, let's face the reality of the kind of structures we're going to have and the kinds of parties we're going to have, and then try to create institutional incentives within that structure. And I like the way someone in the comments has put it, and Ned put it this way: given that we have a polarized culture, how can we work with that to create the healthiest form of democratic politics through institutional design?
So
Go ahead.
let me give it a supplementary twist and maybe a different twist on a couple of things. The supplement is, first of all, thanks, Rick, because you answered, I don't know if you did so intentionally, one of the questions that was asked in the chat about the Seattle voucher system. And I think that, you know, this is a very important example of the kind of law of unintended consequences that our colleague at Stanford, Bruce Kane, gave us in his book, Democracy More or Less, that, you know, you better be careful what you wish for, because some reforms that look good on the surface can, and this often happens with campaign finance, operate very counterintuitively in practice. And so if your goal is to generate incentives and structural inducements to reduce polarization, you might actually better achieve that by raising the limits on campaign contributions and making them more transparent, rather than by the small donor matching program, whose downside Rick has spoken to. And in any case, you only learn that through the rigorous and you know, professional academic analysis of the sort that we are going to undertake. The second point I'll make is about electoral system reform. And I'll say, we enter this with members of our task force pretty seriously disagreeing with one another. I know we have one member who's opposed to ranked choice voting and thinks that the answer is a 2-round runoff like France has. We have another member who has been an outspoken advocate of proportional representation, albeit in small member districts, essentially along the lines of the Fair Representation Act that's been introduced in the last two you know, Congresses in the US. We'll see if they change their views in response to our interactions and in response to our research. I'm a little more agnostic here than Rick is, and my arrival at my agnosticism here, I'm just going to be honest about proportional representation, is driven by the following. On the one hand, I completely agree with Rick. We're not going to get PR at the national level, and probably not going to get it in almost any state anytime soon. On the other hand, if we ever had PR in the United States, I think it should happen the way that is embedded in the Fair Representation Act, which is in small member districts of no more than 5 members, 3 to 5 members. And using this gets a little technical now, the system in essence of Ireland of the single transferable vote, which is the ranked choice voting version of proportional representation, where you have to, through vote transfers, clear a large minimum hurdle in order to get elected in a multi-member district. And I will just say, this concludes my thought on this. I think that I go into this, just to describe to my colleagues and to all of you, really with a level of agony and therefore agnosticism that I haven't had until recently. I think the poison in our party system is, and just be quite honest, in one of the two political parties is now so advanced that it isn't clear to me that you wouldn't, to use Rick's word, and now we're really talking to one another as much as to all of you, it isn't clear to me that you wouldn't more effectively cabin extremism by pushing it into one of the parties in a 3 or 4 party system than by forcing it to keep losing party primaries in one of the 2 major parties. So I enter, just to be honest here, where it's an occasion for free thinking and a gestational moment in our work. I enter here with a lot of doubt and a lot of questions and a lot of seeking of evidence that and kind of analysis, including some scenario analysis that we may run through public opinion polling or other things.
And if I can add to that and to echo what Rick said earlier about, we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves and ahead of the analysis and the data that we're going to do, but to pick up on some themes that I'm seeing in the chat. I gave a presentation a couple of weeks ago to a conference of the Association of American Law Schools, and one of the things I did was entertain a hypothesis which needs to be further explored through real evidence about 2 different versions of ranked choice voting and how they would handle the same set of voter preferences in a hypothetical state like my own of Ohio, where the voters were getting increasingly polarized, and you had 4 candidates, 2 that were more extreme, one on the left and one on the left, 2 other candidates that were more moderate. And the 2, without getting too wonky here, the 2 different versions of ranked choice voting handled the same set of voter preferences very differently, at least with this hypothetical profile of an electorate. And so one of the things that we want to do is gain the insight from that ex ante consideration of the issue as creating a hypothesis to be tested empirically. And so that's kind of an example of where we are at the early phase. We've got we're looking at this issue of extremism. How do we ameliorate it? We're aware of how the mathematics of different voting systems potentially could create different effects, but we want to study this in a lot greater detail.
Can I jump in for a second? Because we're nearing our time limit on the evening, and there are 2 or 3 things I'd like to at least be sure I say before people start dropping off. One of them, of course, is to thank the panelists for not only introducing the subject and the mission and the objectives of what the task force will do, but also starting the discussion, which I think we've enjoyed listening to. And I think I can assure all the people who've commented in the chat that we will be sure everybody on the panel gets a chance to look at all those comments and benefit from them, take them into their thinking. Second point, I think certainly there's some non-intuitive aspects of this that I am delighted that it will be looked at. I'm not sure I'd choose Larry's terminology of agnostically, but scientifically with objectivity in terms of avoiding some of the non-intuitive or the intuitive traps that are dangerous. Third thing I'd like to just mention, I know Larry had also brought up the question of funding, and while I know the funding is less critical in the age of Zoom and other abilities to communicate, I'm sure there are some needs, and if people on the call would like to be contributing, is there a way that can be done, Larry, or how would that happen?
Any contribution can be made in a tax deductible fashion, either to Ohio State or Stanford, and probably simpler for it to go to election law at Ohio State. And so if anyone's interested in support or supporting or knows a philanthropy that might want to do so, they can just get in touch with one of us, and eventually they'll be in touch with Ned. And we obviously welcome that. We're in a kind of development mode right now to fund our operations, and we're making some progress, but we need to make more. Thank you.
I think.
And you're muted, Mike.
I think we can also say that we'll be in touch with the folks on the call and probably those who registered didn't show up for one reason or another to let them know how they can stay informed or connected with the task force as you begin your work.
Okay, and I think if there's possible still, we're virtually out of time, but at least 1 or 2 minute summarized concluding statements from the panelists. I'll turn it back to Robin to introduce the order.
Unmute yourself, Robin.
You're muted, Robin, sorry.
Let's go with Rick first.
Well, I just mainly want to say thank you all to all of you for the work you're doing with the Reform Election Network and for your engagement with these issues. It is it's not a time I think most of us ever thought we would face in the United States, and these kinds of challenges to the legitimacy of democracy in the United States. And it's incredibly important that people be engaged and active and contribute. And we're doing what we can on our end, and I appreciate all of you being as engaged and doing the kind of work you're doing too. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Didi.
I'd like to just echo what Rick said. Thank you to all of you. I think that our debate shows why a task force like this can get a lot of good work done. There are just a lot of unresolved questions, but also the activism of people like Reform Elections Now, people on this call, is also what makes us hopeful that the task force's recommendations will be important and useful.
Larry?
Well, first of all, Robin, thank you for your very able and graceful and effective moderation of our event today. A big thanks to Mike, who I've been dealing with for some time now, who's really become a friend and an inspiration and a prod to productivity. And to Peter and to Herb and all of the rest of you, you have quite a unique group here. And I think this is Alexis de Tocqueville's vision of America on screen right now. And it's very inspiring to political scientists and legal scholars who study civil society and institutions in the abstract. I'll just say finally, this is not a partisan effort. And I think you all understand that as one of our members, Mickey Edwards, says, we need to be Americans first before we're Democrats or Republicans. And we got into this problem as a, not exclusively the work of one party or perspective. And we're only going to get out of it by cooperation across party and ideological lines.
Ned?
Just thank you so much for convening this. It's been a great discussion, and I feel privileged to be part of it. So thanks for including me, and I look forward to working with all of you and echo what my fellow steering committee members have said about what we believe is hopefully the utility of the work that we're embarking on. So thank you.
Bye-bye.
Well, thank you, everyone. This has been a lot of fun for me, and I've really enjoyed this evening's discussion.
Thanks to everyone. And we're going to leave the chat box open just a few minutes, or at least a couple of minutes. So if there's any other comments you want to add, we'll